Anyone who has traveled along the St. Mary's River in modern times has probably noticed this as they passed Detour Village at the mouth of the St. Mary's River. What is it? Well, to a boat nerd, it appears to very likely be the remains of a paddle wheel from an old steamboat. If that's so, however, the questions come up: how did it get here? Was it from a shipwreck? Or a fire? Is it from one of those big, luxurious passenger steamers of the early 1900s? Or is it from one of those old-time historic paddle wheelers of the 1800s? If that's where it came from, is the rest of the boat down there under the water? The imagination spools up. Yet the answer is both none of the above and some of the above. Believe it or not, this history begins in 1850s Scotland. On February 7th, 1850, the railroad car ferry Leviathan made a run between Granton and Bunce Island for the Edinburgh, Perth, and Dundee Railroad. Most sources consider this to be the first self-propelled railroad car ferry. At that same time, the port of Buffalo was beginning to boom. Being the western terminus of the Erie Canal, the port city was moving every product from animal hides to grain. Meanwhile, over in Canada, they were looking to spread their rail lines west to Goderich and Windsor. Following the U.S. Civil War, there was a focus on rail commerce between the cities of Detroit and Windsor. The only obstacle was the Detroit River, which at its most narrow point is just over 1,800 feet wide. In that era, it was too far for a bridge, and the technology for tunneling just wasn't there yet. The answer was, if you couldn't extend the rails across the river, why not just float them across? This Scottish concept had been used on the lakes in the late 1850s, when the small wooden steamer International had floated railroad cars on the Niagara River between Buffalo and Fort Erie. What was needed next was a reliable way to move those cars across the Detroit River. Thus was born the Detroit River car float steamers. Through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, there grew a fleet of assorted car floats for assorted railroads. Some were propellers and some were sidewheelers. It is said that the captains liked the sidewheelers better because they were able to make sharper turns. These car floats worked day and night, 7 days a week, year-round, in spite of the ice. In the winter months, the Detroit River's ice can move with a current between 2 and 4 miles per hour and can be several feet thick. Yet the car floats churned ahead. Often passenger trains were ferried across the river as well as cargo. In the winter, loading the car floats was a time-consuming, bitter-cold, laborious task. Rail cars were held in place by wheel clamps alone because, unlike on the open lakes, there were very few waves and very little rolling was encountered. Now imagine yourself on a cold winter day on a railroad car in Windsor waiting to be switched onto a car float to go to Detroit. Of course, there had to be room as well for the freight cars that may be placed next to yours. Then once all the cars were loaded, the car float had to break ice in order to edge out of the slip. and then break its way upriver to the next slip on the American side, where you'll be rolled off the ferry and switch to whatever track takes you to your destination in Detroit. The whole event could potentially take hours. Of course, today, people complain about traffic on the bridge being backed up. Of that fleet of Detroit River car floats, one is key to our story. She is the Michigan Central. Although every single modern source states that this car float, Michigan Central, was built in 1884, that is incorrect. In fact, she was constructed at Wyandotte, Michigan in 1883 by the Detroit Dry Dock Company. She was launched on Monday, December 11th, 1883 at 11 o'clock in the morning. By the way, trains taking spectators to see the launch will be departing at 8:30 and returning at 12:20 Standard Time. It'll be a sight worth seeing. How's that for research, folks? Correcting some really bad history. The confusion in the modern history books is rooted in the fact that the boat was registered in 1884, although it was launched in 1883. The Michigan Central was a sidewheel steamer with 3 tracks on her deck. Her power plant consisted of 2 horizontal condensing steam plants with 2 cylinders each. She had 4 firebox boilers. On her 3 tracks, she carried a total of 21 cars. Named for her parent railroad, the Michigan Central was the 3rd ferry for her namesake railroad and was ordered to meet the heavy demand in rail traffic in both 1882 and 1883. Her iron hull made her a good icebreaker across the Detroit River. She had a very productive career, and it was otherwise unremarkable. Then in 1910, the Windsor to Detroit Railroad Tunnel was opened, and there was far less need for car floats. Soon many of the Detroit River ferries, including the Michigan Central, were laid up. On June 13, 1913, it seemed like she had a reprieve when she was purchased by the Kelly Island Limestone and Transport Company. The plan consisted of a project for her to haul rail hopper cars filled with rock products between Marblehead, Ohio, and Sandusky. That plan fizzled out, and the car float returned to layup in the Rouge River. Finally, on August 14, 1923, the Michigan Central was purchased by Thomas DeRoche of Detour, Michigan. He towed her to his boatyard at the mouth of the St. Mary's River. His intention was to turn her into a barge. Once at Detour, his crew stripped away her cabins, engine works, and side wheels. Of the 2 side wheels, one was deposited on the shore of Frying Pan Island. And the other was simply plopped into the water where we can see it today. Finally, on October 27, 1926, the barge Michigan Central was caught in an autumn storm near Cockburn Island and sank in False Detour Passage. Her crew escaped to her tug, the General. The exact circumstances of that sinking are very unclear. However, Mr. DeRoche had a fair number of barges and tugs that just happened to sink or burn. His former property is littered with assorted wrecks and pieces, and became well known among lake mariners as a boneyard of bygone lake boats. Thus, now you know the whole story of that mostly submerged paddle wheel at Detour Village? The answer to the question is both none of the above and some of the above.